Well, that's a fun gospel reading, isn't it? It's a parable. And, we usually hear Jesus' parables as these nice little illustrations that teach us something about the kingdom of heaven. Think about a famous one. A sower went out to sow, and he scatters seeds on different kinds of soil. And different things happen in 3 locations, and each of those situations stands for something. And then the ending wraps it up with a nice tidy bow. Those are fun parables. And then there's this morning's parable, which is not tidy and doesn't have a bow on it. This parable of the dishonest manager, I guess I would invite you to consider hearing this one very differently. And I think actually it's okay for us to do that, because parables are not necessarily tidy little Sunday school stories. They're about human experience. And like the human experience that Jesus came to inhabit, sometimes parables are messy. And today's is maybe the messiest one of all. Great. So, just to recap a bit, a dishonest manager either wastes or steals from his employer and gets caught. The manager tries to cushion the blow of being fired by ingratiating himself with his customers, reducing their bills so that they will help him out. And Jesus apparently commends such behavior to the disciples, advising them to make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth. Okay, we all get that, right? Here's a secret. Given what we know about Jesus, that doesn't make any sense. I know it's what the words of the readings say, but it doesn't make any sense, really. Well, in a situation like this, you can find all sorts of interpretations trying to make it make sense. Maybe the manager is nobly cutting those bills by the amount of his own commission, in which case the manager is sacrificing his earnings because he realizes he's at fault. Okay. Or maybe the lesson is broader, about making friends with the powerless, giving to them with no strings attached so that the poor might welcome you into the kingdom of heaven. Okay. But the truth is, there is no commonly recognized way of making sense of this parable. So that gives us the opportunity to look at it from a different angle. Now, I can't promise you that this is the right interpretation, because, with parables, the point is that they spur a variety of interpretations. That's why biblical interpretation is fun. At least for some geeks, it's fun, really. So this is the first of 2 parables that Jesus tells about the dangers of idolizing wealth. And I think it's important that this one is an intimate tale, one not told to crowds of thousands, but just to the disciples, to the people closest to Jesus. So imagine Jesus telling this story over pizza and beer, rather than from a pulpit, okay? It's that kind of a story. And, if you will, imagine that it's more a comedic sketch than a lecture on proper behavior. So, in this story, the rich man probably isn't God, which we might suppose, but probably is just a rich man. Because the story isn't about him anyway. Ethically, he's a neutral character in this story. The story's actually about the rich man's manager, who was an important servant in households of that time and place, sort of like Carson, the butler in Downton Abbey, right? But I think the character of this manager is about as far from Carson in Downton Abbey as you can get. Because in fact, this manager is a scoundrel, a talented con man who at least is blessed with self-awareness, if nothing else. He's indolent, he's too weak to work hard and too proud to beg. So, having been caught skimming money, his solution is to ingratiate himself with the people who owe debts to his boss. He invites them to join him in committing fraud. Because, it's in the customer's interest to save the money, after all. But he's actually scamming them every bit as much as he scammed the rich man. They will have to take care of the manager once he's fired because he's going to blackmail them into silence. I mean, as a scam, this is Hollywood worthy. This is good stuff. Well, the rich man finds out what's going on, and he is impressed with the manager's cunning and the shrewdness of his plot, probably wishing that the manager had used those talents to help build his business instead of stealing from him, but okay. So that's the story. And looking at his friends around the table with the pizza and the beer, Jesus sort of comments on this, observing that the children of the light, the good folks, his followers, they aren't very shrewd in their dealings with the world, letting themselves be taken advantage of by folks with a dubious moral compass. Jesus says, just because you like to serve others doesn't mean you want them duping you, right? So at this point, I imagine the disciples looking up from their pizza and thinking, now wait a minute. A while back, Jesus, you told us that if somebody takes our shirt, we're supposed to give him our coat too. So now you're saying you want us to be more like this dishonest manager and look out for ourselves? And as they sit there chewing their pizza and wondering about all this, maybe one of the disciples, probably Peter, because Peter was good at sticking his foot in his mouth, maybe one of the disciples asks that question out loud. Well, Jesus, is this the way you want us to act? Like the dishonest manager? Is that how you want us to be? And I imagine Jesus, looking over his glasses at the poor sap and getting maybe a little snarky, a little sarcastic. And he says, yeah, right. Make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it's gone, those folks will welcome you into the eternal homes. That's a great plan. So if Jesus' response is wholly sarcasm, then what he says next makes way more sense as the point of his teaching. No, of course not, Jesus says. Of course I don't want you to do that. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much. And by the same token, whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest in much. If you aren't faithful with the wealth you have here, why would God trust you with the greatest treasure of all, eternal life? Look, he says, you can't honor two masters. You can't serve God and wealth. Well, whatever you want to do in interpreting this story, that last word is really important. Wealth. So in the Greek text, it's not just wealth, it's mammon, which sounds like a great word from Elizabethan English, and it was, but it actually was Greek first, mammon. That word goes back to a root that has to do with confidence, like where we place our trust. So mammon doesn't just mean wealth, it means wealth in which we place our trust, wealth that functions as an idol for us. So can you serve God with wealth? Absolutely, in very holy ways. Can you worship wealth as your God? Only at your own risk. Well, for us, I think it's not very comfortable or comforting when Jesus talks to us this way, but he is standing firmly in the tradition of the prophets, whom God sent not to comfort the people, at least not off the bat, but to confront them instead. And in our first reading, we hear from Amos, one of the earliest of the Old Testament prophets. Now, like most of the prophets, Amos was not exactly a popular guy. because God had called him to bring the word to the leaders of the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, at a time of peace and prosperity, at least for the folks at the top of the ladder. The people with power and status and influence, they were doing just fine, thank you very much, keeping the letter of the law by observing the proper religious festivals and making the temple offerings that the law required. But at the same time, they were shortchanging their poor customers and selling worthless merchandise and profiting from the slave labor that came from people who couldn't pay their debts. So like the teaching that Jesus brings us today, Amos's word indicts that perspective that profit and wealth are themselves the ultimate good, more important than God and God's command to love neighbor. You know, if we demote the Lord and make money our God, Amos says, God is going to return the favor and bring the kingdom to somebody else. In Amos's day, that meant judgment in a very outward and visible way, destroying the kingdom of Israel and sending its leaders and people off into exile. That's what's coming, Amos said. And just a few decades later, he was proven right. So that's pretty confrontational stuff between what Amos and Jesus have to say. But to the extent that the story fits, we have to wear it. I mean, life offers us many idols, many not gods in which we might place our trust. Mammon is certainly one of them, though it's not the only one. Our golden calves can be all kinds of things. Position and authority, or other people's perception of us, or being the expert, or simply getting what we want. But all of those things, like money, can lure us into putting something in the place of God and trusting that instead, which is what idolatry is. And when we do that, our actions tell the story of where our priorities lie. As the wealthy and powerful of Amos's day might have put it, come on, when's all this God talk going to be over so we can get back to business? Because it was their own efforts, their own projects that they seemed to think would save them. And that didn't work out so well. So, here on a rainy Sunday morning, there we have our happy little readings for this morning, this day. I mean, they're hard to hear, but maybe we need a little confrontation. Sometimes we don't recognize just how lost we are until somebody hits us upside the head with it. But remember that judgment is not God's last word. Not for the prophets, not for Jesus. I mean, remember what we heard last Sunday, that God goes to great lengths to find the sheep who are lost. Or think about the parable of the prodigal son, which comes immediately before Jesus' odd teaching this morning, actually. In that parable of the prodigal, God waits patiently for us, for all of us children, to recognize how we squander what God gives us and how we honor ourselves instead. But once we look around at our lives and sort of shake our heads and see how far we are from missing the mark, God welcomes us back with open arms, rejoicing that we finally figured out just how lost we are. And that very day, life begins again.